The subject of my first conference is balance instead of harmony, conditioning and ideas of the liturgical movement on the eve of the Second Vatican Council. 100 years has passed since so-called liturgical movement appeared in the Church. Within some milieu, even to not very numerous but fairly active, the desire arose to make the piety of whole of the faithful more grounded within the communal prayer of the Church. This movement has always shown some kind of longing for the Middle Ages, the period when liturgy was indeed a model for all prayer, and the liturgical year constituted the main calendar for the Catholics. But the real motive behind the creation of this movement was not such a nostalgia, but the anxiety based on a sober diagnosis. The divorce of inherited liturgical forms and piety of the mass of the faithful, which process in characteristic for the late modernity has caused this piety firstly to break away from its objective church model, then to break up into numerous particular services, and sometimes simply to degenerate or burn out. The fact that personal piety was in practice narrowed down to private prayers and spiritual exercises made it easy to regard social dimension of life as in a way natural, no longer under the influence of religion. Meanwhile, the social sphere was increasingly colonized by secular ideologies, both left and right-wing ones. Therefore, since the days of Dom Guéranger, of Solesmes, the aim of the whole liturgical movement was to shape the piety with the liturgy, with the communal prayer of the Church, in order to make traditional lex orandi, rather than services secondary to it, a permanent source of and model for the Catholic spirituality. In the beginning of the 20th century, this idea was explained as the desire to make the masses of the faithful actually take part in the liturgy. It concerned both the crowds still attending the churches and those that ceased to do so. This intention was expressed in the notion of participatio actuosa, that soon became the watchword of the whole renewal. The idea was sanctioned and promoted in the documents of the three popes, St. Pius X, Pius XI, and Pius XII. It wasn't about creating yet another light of specific spirituality comparable to social activists, zealots of particular services, or club of theology lovers. Promoters of the liturgical movement were aware of the fact that they act for the common good. One of the chief representatives of the movement, Belgian Dom Lambert Baudouin, wrote in 1924, "Let's be practical. Millions of Belgians, to mention only this small country, gather each Sunday only to attend a liturgical assembly headed by the priest who can celebrate the liturgy due to the authority given to him by God and the people. The faithful gather in spacious buildings located in the centers of human settlements, designed and consecrated for worship, willing to fulfill the work according to Pius X, is the first and irreplaceable source of Christian life. May this fact which we still take too little advantage of, become a life-giving act. Everything is in place. Now all we need is to enrich the life of this organism. Can we even for a moment question the practical nature of such an undertaking? This was the question of Dom Lambert Baudouin. As we can see in this statement by Dom Baudouin, taken from a booklet that expands upon the thesis of his famous paper given in the Malines Congress in 1999. There is, of course, a tension between the announcement that substantially nothing will change and the call to enrich the life of this organism. This tension was a point of departure for a few various, indeed divergent, recipes that oscillate between the desire to transform the liturgy fundamentally in its human aspects and determination in transforming the pastoral care so that it would adjust itself to essential liturgical tradition. The real context of formation of modern liturgical movement was, of course, liturgical life of the Church, which for centuries had been determined by the Tridentine order of the liturgy. However, when we speak of the Tridentine order of the liturgy, we are using a mental shortcut. It would be a mistake to think that the resolutions accepted at the Council of Trent led to creation of some new order of worship within the Catholic Church. In fact, the Pope's implementing post-Tridentine reform of the liturgy, with St. Pius V in the first place, only brought to general use already existing standard of Roman liturgy, which had only been slightly modified. All in all, it should be said that in the Tridentine order of the liturgy is both specific doctrinal disciplinary case or cover, created indeed after the Council of Trent, as well as its content, that is a given shape of Latin liturgical tradition almost identical with the pre-Tridentine Roman liturgy, and preserving incontestable and clearly visible continuity with its medieval and Gregorian form, and through them with the very beginnings of the Roman Rite. So-called Tridentine liturgical books were in fact identical to their pre-Tridentine equivalents from the Roman Church, with regard not only to their essence, but also to their substance, and usually to their particular shape as well. Meanwhile, the Tridentine case or cover consisted of various kinds of elements. Among the significant ones, there were certainly such aspects as far-reaching Romanization, or rather papalization, of the Latin liturgy, extending obligation to use Roman books on the whole Church of the Latin Rite, with some exceptions deriving from respect for acknowledged particular traditions, for example, for Dominicans. Centralization of power, management of liturgical issues as exclusive prerogative of the Pope, who can act in person or through liturgical congregation. And a legal form of precise codification of texts, nigrics and rubrics, within typical edition as well as through translations decrees, or responses. Other issues worth to be mentioned include, on the one hand, proclaiming that the codified form of the Roman liturgy represents its pristine shape. In the bull Quo Primum of St. Pius V, which promulgated the Roman Missal, and was part of each and every edition of this Missal until the reform of 1969, St. Pius V spoke of restoring the Missal to the pristine form and rite of the Holy Fathers. Ad pristinam sanctorum patrum normam accretum. This inaccuracy, which could have resulted from the post-Renaissance atmosphere permeated by fascination with the sources of all things, may be regarded nowadays as a ticking bomb, bound to explode into so-called archaeologism, when rationalistic cult of sources became intensified. And, to continue, on the other hand, inclination to regulate the development of liturgy exclusively through rubrics, propers, and calendar, with total freezing of so-called nigrics from ordo, but in the same time with consent to the growth of paraliturgical devotions that was supposed to make up for this stiffening. As I already mentioned, an important part of this Tridentine case of the old liturgical tradition was exclusive papal authority in the field of liturgy. That principle itself was briefly and clearly described in the Code of Canon Law from 1917. Unius apostolice sedis est tum sacram ordinare liturgiam tum liturgicos approbare libros. This factor, introduced in fact at the request of the Ecumenical Council of Trent, successfully protected the Roman rite from deformations that could have resulted from its spontaneous adaptations to various trends of modernity. However, hasn't this protective factor itself been subjected to some deformations precisely under the influence of some modern ideologies? It seems that already in the times of St. Pius X, the practice of the Pope's sovereign authority in the field of liturgy started to show a tendency towards something that could be called liturgical absolutism of modern times popes. In case of these popes, such an inclination competed with an earlier principle, according to which the authority consists in guarding the entrusted deposit. But new absolutist tendency prevailed in some cases, including several acts of uppermost significance. In the field of liturgy, one could indicate, for example, in-depth reorganization of the Roman breviary by St. Pius X, or even to a greater extent, some reformist moves by Pius XII, which he undertook out of his care for the breviary psalter and restoration of the Holy Week services. In the spirit of the liturgy, Cardinal Ratzinger states that, citation, after the Second Vatican Council, the impression arose that the Pope really could do anything in the liturgical matters. However, the origins of this phenomenon are clearly older than the Vaticanum Secundum, as they are rooted in the absolutist interpretation of both post-Tridentine highest authority of popes in the field of liturgy and understanding of popes' supremacy in general. Citation from Cardinal Ratzinger. In fact, the First Vatican Council had in no way defined the Pope as an absolute monarch. On the contrary, it presented him as a guarantor of obedience to the revealed word. The Pope's authority is bound to the tradition of faith, and that also applies to the liturgy. It is not manufactured by the authorities. Even the Pope can only be a humble servant of its lawful development and abiding integrity and identity. The authority of the Pope is not unlimited. It is at the service of sacred tradition. The principle of the Pope's liturgical sovereignty, already visible in some acts by St. Pius X and Pius XII, was openly expressed in the liturgical encyclical Mediator Dei, issued in 1947 by Pius XII. This principle constitutes a strong refrain of the encyclical, as the author repeatedly speaks of the absolute authority of the Holy See, and explicitly states that the Pope has the right to recognize and establish, to introduce and approve new rites, which can be modified by him if he judges that they require modification. If we also take into consideration that there are not so many references to tradition as such in the encyclical of such an importance as Mediator Dei, and that the notion of liturgical tradition does not constitute a significant benchmark in the document, then we can see that the emphasis on the prerogatives of the highest authority has even stronger undertone, gaining the status of the first principle of the liturgical order. Even if we bear in mind that this undertone was also connected with the desire to tame some too unconstrained experiments of the liturgical movement, the general impression remains the same. Still, if we describe it as some kind of absolutism, we must also add that it strived to be an enlightened absolutism, taking into consideration the researchers' achievements and the experts' opinions. Of course, provided that this other side respects the Pope's highest authority. A perfect illustration of these concepts may be found in the speech by Cardinal Gaetano Cicognani, prefect of the Congregation of Rites, given at the famous Liturgical Assisi Congress in 1956. The essential end of this Congress is to pass in review the admirable initiatives of Pope Pius XII in the field of pastoral liturgy, and to pass them in review with the spirit of loyalty and reverence which every one of the faithful ought to nourish toward the Supreme Shepherd, who guides us. The liturgy demands precisely the direction of the Supreme Shepherd. We have come together not to study problems or to propose reforms, but to put into life their laws and ordinances emanating from the Pope Pius XII in his untiring activity as Father and Master. Looking over the documents which integrate this liturgical period, we have been able to notice that His Holiness welcomes with delicate courtesy what the students of the liturgy present or indicate. But in virtue of the supreme power which belong only to him, it is the Pope who fixes the principles, giving secure and firm orientations to minds and spirits. He puts them on guard against opinions not in conformity with the aim of the spiritual life. End of citation. Long before the Second Vatican Council, the promise of a general reform of the liturgy started to blossom within a confidential encounter of the highest authority that fixes the principles with the researchers who present or indicate some issues. To some extent, it was happening without regard to the context of tradition and to the principles of the organic development of liturgy. A document of special importance for the analysis of the reformers' intentions is the Memoria sulla riforma liturgica, a text drawn up in 1948 by the historical section of the Congregation of Rites, then reviewed by the consultors and discussed by a special commission appointed by Pius XII to prepare a general reform of the liturgy, the so-called Paean Commission. The document was confidential and indeed became a point of departure for reforms undertaken by Pius XII. Later also the members of the Commission on the Liturgy of the Second Vatican Council had access to this text. Giving a reason for the reform of the liturgy, the Memoria begins with a statement that the liturgy suffers from a number of problems, such as an uncrowded calendar, too many octaves, complexity of the rubrics, and all this is said to diminish the love of the priests for the liturgy. Hence, there arises a desire for a reform that would bring about a sensible simplification and a greater stabilization of the liturgy. Fortunately, the development of liturgical studies allows a solid revision of the liturgy on a broad and secure basis in liturgical science. Therefore, it is possible to fulfill the desire reinforced by the liturgical movement to make the liturgy freed from certain accretions that obscure its beauty and diminish, in a certain sense, its efficacy. After a concise recollection of earlier projects meant to modify the liturgy, fundamental principles of future reform are presented in the Memoria. First of those 3 points says, citation, the opposed claims of the conservative tendency and the innovative tendency must be balanced. This first principle is later developed in number 16, where so-called archaeologism on the one hand and innovativeness on the other are indicated as two unacceptable extremes. Then the document states, now, a wise reform of the liturgy must balance the two tendencies. That is, conserve good and healthy traditions, verified on historico-critical basis, and take account of new elements already opportunely introduced and needing to be introduced. Since the liturgy is a living organism, so the liturgy, which is a continuous manifestation of religious vitality of the Church, cannot be something set in stone. Rather, it must develop as in fact it has developed in parallel line with all the other vital manifestations of the Church. Hence, it is the task of the liturgical reform to balance the just demands of the opposed tendencies in such a way as not to change through sheer itching for novelty and not to mummify through exaggerated archaeological valuation. To renew, therefore, courageously what is truly necessary and indispensable, to renew and to conserve jealously what one can and must conserve. End of citations. It is easy to sense the appeal for some restraint and prudence behind these words. But it is the balance that seems to be a central notion here. And balance is always about allowing the opposing forces to act in order to sustain some object which would otherwise literally lose its balance. The authors of the Memoria are aware of the fact that there exist just opposed tendencies, and their counsel is to balance them through a wise reform. Interestingly, the things to be balanced are idea of change and idea of preservation, while pastoral care for liturgical participation, so significant within the liturgical movement, is not even mentioned here. The balance of forces seems to prevail over the harmony of the whole entity. Indeed, there was plenty of those just opposed tendencies in what we call the liturgical movement in its full bloom. Their justness was sometimes based on their very nature, but sometimes only on the fact that so far their extremism had not had the chance to be exposed. To realize the existence of those contradictions, which sometimes remain concealed, it is enough to compare two leading personages of the movement, Dom Bernard Capelle on the one hand, and Father Joseph Jungmann on the other. They can be seen as the symbols of two different guiding ideas, together with two different atmospheres of reform that result from them. Dom Bernard Capelle, a Benedictine abbot of Montcésar, an exquisite scholar and monk, can be rightly considered a patron of the principle of the organic development of the liturgy. He presented it in an outstandingly clear manner in 1949 in his annotations to the project of the reform prepared for the Payne Commission. The whole of this excerpt is worth to be cited. Especially that this text, due to its original confidentiality, is not very well known nowadays. As Dom Capelle stated, citation, "Nothing is to be changed unless it is a case of indispensable necessity. This rule is most wise. For the liturgy is truly a sacred testament and monument, not so much written but living, of tradition, which is to be reckoned with as a locus of theology, and is a most pure font of piety and of the Christian spirit. Therefore, first, That which serves well at the present time is sufficient unless it is gravely deficient. Second, only new things that are necessary are to be introduced, and in a way that is consonant with tradition. Third, nothing is to be changed unless there is comparatively great gain to be had. Fourth, practices that have fallen into disuse are to be restored if their reintroduction would truly render the rites more pure and more intelligible to the minds of the faithful. Reservations emphasized by Dom Capelle should not be regarded as a conservative obstacle put in the way of any reform. The Belgian monk was able to see clearly the connection between the tradition, hence also the liturgy, and the life, hence also the change. His care was to avoid both a dead rigidity and an evolutionism which is nothing but another name for decomposition. In the same time, Father Joseph Jungmann, a Jesuit and a professor of pastoral theology from Innsbruck, had just published his monumental 2-volume work Missarum Solemnia, which almost immediately made him an authority on liturgical matters and allowed him to have an increasing influence over liturgical reforms later in the 50s. An erudite in historical issues, Father Jungmann expressed in his publication the conviction that the greatness of the Roman Rite consists in that what is ancient in it. However, this assessment may also have its negative and disquieting aspect. It is easy to conclude that what is younger than antiquity is also bound to diminish the Roman Rite. And Father Jungmann indeed accepted such a logic, as he distinguished the noble core of the primitive rite from the secondary additions, especially those medieval and younger. In one of his main works, published firstly in 1958, Father Jungmann was gentle but in the same time explicit on the matter. The citation: "The liturgy of the Catholic Church is an edifice in which we are still living today, and in essentials it is the same building in which Christians were already living 10 or 15 or even 18 and more centuries ago. In the course of all these centuries, the structure has become more and more complicated, with constant remodelings and additions, and so the plan of the building has been obscured so much so that we may no longer feel quite at home in it because we no longer understand it." End of the citation. Father Jungmann added that if we should have the opportunity to make changes in the structure or to adapt it to the needs of our own people, we will then do so in such a way that, where possible, nothing of the precious heritage of the past is lost. The end of the citation. We should not be deceived by the general promise to act with delicacy, given its latter sentence. A few years earlier, in 1951, the very same author stated at the closed conference held in Maria-Laach that those prayers from the Missal which are no older than the Carolingian era would really all have to vanish, unless utterly convincing, justifying reasons for preserving some of them would be given. What in a diagnosis of the Tridentine liturgy given by Jungmann historian was simply distinguishing the golden age from later layers of corruption. Here, in a recommendation by Jungmann, expert of ecclesiastical bodies, became an archaeologism, rather ruthless towards forms deemed as too young, who in the same time are rather ready to succumb to arguments relating to the needs of the modern man. Father Jungmann was certainly too a competent historian not to see and not to admire to phenomenon we called the organic development of the liturgy. The difference between him and Dom Capel was that he did not consider this natural law of development to be also a principle of the reform. On the contrary, one could say that he regarded the reform as a remedy for this too unconstrained mechanism of growth. Hence, on the eve of the council, he openly stated that what we need instead of an imperceptible growth is a jerk, more than a jerk. Both Capel and Jungmann desired the reform of the liturgy, but, as we can see, their opinions even on its principles were simply contradictory. Their reformative concepts differed not in terms of radicalism, but much deeper in their very essence. Once we realize this, we are able to foresee real tensions or even hidden contradictions within a later constitution on the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council, since both of them had a deep impact on its content. From those personages that above all were the spokesmen for particular ideas, let's now move to those that held also some political authority while working on the reforms documents, being members of ecclesiastical bodies appointed to prepare the liturgical reform, both in times of Pius XII and during the Second Vatican Council. Without any hesitation, I would indicate two such personages, Father Ferdinando Antonelli and Father Annibale Bonini. Father Ferdinando Antonelli was a historian and an expert in Christian archaeology, as well as an entrusted member of the historical section of the Congregation of Rites. It was he who, together with Father Josef Löwe, edited the above-mentioned Memoria sulla Riforma Liturgica. Father Antonelli brings into our picture of the guiding ideas of the reform the piece that could be called a firm option for the liturgical re-education of the faithful. As someone deeply involved in such modifications of the rite as the reform of the services of the Holy Week, Antonelli, of course, appreciated such retouche of the liturgy and considered them necessary, but his main care was to make deep changes within the mentalities, rather than to transform the structures of the rites. At the Assisi Congress in 1956, Antonelli, while referring precisely to the recent reform of the services of the Holy Week, clearly stated, "The liturgical reforms does not consist only or even principally in a revision of texts and rubrics, the search for wealthier and more expressive aesthetic forms. Nor does the reform end with simplifications. abbreviations, or emendations. The true aim of the liturgical reform looks much farther, beyond any outward expression, and wants to reach the soul in order to work in its depth and incite a spiritual renewal in Christ, the high priest, from whom every liturgical action acquires its value and efficacy. End of citation. The emphasis on the necessity of such re-education presupposed also critical evaluation of the last centuries. But Antonelli's critique, unlike that of Jungmann, concerned not the liturgy's line of development, but separating the devotion from the liturgy, and the loss of liturgical compass within Christian piety. In the very same speech he stated, "The people have been separated, unfortunately, from the true liturgical life. A patient work of re-education, spiritual and technical, is needed to bring them back to an active, enlightened, personal, communitarian participation. This is a work that is not done in a year. It may require generations, but it must begin." The end of citations. Pastoral dimension of the reform was a matter of huge importance also for Father Annibale Bugnini, the first editor-in-chief of the acclaimed Ephemerides Liturgicae. But unlike Antonelli, Bugnini was much more deeply convinced that far-reaching changes in the structure of the rite are needed. A conviction he unobtrusively signaled already in his text from 1948, when precisely in the Ephemerides he called for further revision of the liturgical books, which had been started in 1911 by St. Pius X, but was later interrupted in 1914 due to the lack of necessary critical studies. As far as the direction of those revisions is concerned, Bugnini was rather clear-cut in his support for the dictate of so-called pastoral expediencies. In his statements from the 50s, we can easily trace a pragmatic admiration for successful adaptations to life, even if some of those movements had the fault of breaking with tradition. He regarded them as an indication that showed some necessity. Hence, it is crucial to grasp the idea of adaptation to life in order to understand Bugnini's attitude. Moreover, according to him, there is no need of proving that such a necessity exists, as already mere pastoral benefit is enough to justify brave creations, cuts, and shifts within the ritual. Even this short, non-exhaustive account clearly shows that under the umbrella of the movement for fruitful liturgical participation of the faithful, we can find ideas which are in fact contradictory. It was possible for them to coexist within a polymorphic movement, but using them as inspirations for a particular reform required finding a balance between those various forces, or accepting a false compromise imposed by some absolute authority, power. The course of the liturgical reform, both during the Second Vatican Council and especially after its closure, shows that it was rather Bunini's energy and Jungmann's concepts that shaped its practice. Meanwhile, a deep sense of tradition, like the one represented by Capelle, remained rather quiet warning against possible abuses. And Antonelli's sober enthusiasm found expression in polishing the outcomes of the others' efforts. The testimonies found in the texts and confirmed by behavior of the reformers seem to suggest that on the eve of the Second Vatican Council, it was more or less consciously agreed that the liturgical reform requires balance, or the tension between various forces that counteract and thus keep the liturgy in the right position. At the time, a number of such pairs of counteracting forces could have been indicated and included not only in the ideological opposition of the archaeologists and the innovators, but also the tensions between the papal absolutism and the increasing power of the experts, the advocates of the worship and the advocates of the pastoral reasons, the supporters of Roman centralism and those postulating the collegiality, and finally between the conservatives and the progressivists. The balance between them was possible as long as each of these forces played the assigned role, inevitably one-sided and therefore also rather exaggerated. But as soon as one of these major forces ceased to be unambiguously conservative or innovative, the balance of the whole entity was inescapably threatened, if not destroyed. However, it is worth mentioning in these last words of this lecture that the concept of balance, usually fragile, changeable, negotiable, reminding of constant tug of war, may have an alternative, namely the concept of harmony. And the harmony is an inherent convergence of factors that may differ in their significance, but jointly constitute the whole entity. Of course, search for the harmony, although in liturgical matters and ministry, does not in itself remove the existence of the opposed tendencies, and does not exempt us from facing them within the debate and the politics. But it gives us a different, more reliable measure than the one basing on the naive conviction that the truth is always somewhere in the middle. The ultimate human values, beauty, goodness, love, etc., depend on harmony rather than on balance. Thank you.